Good evening, I'm Joe Nye, and I'd like to welcome you to the Edwin L. Godkin Lectures. The Godkin Lectures were founded in 1903 by friends of Edwin L. Godkin, who is the editor of The Nation and the New York Evening Post. Over the years, the series has included such distinguished lecturers as Walter Lippmann, Robert Moses, Adlai Stevenson, Nelson Rockefeller, and 3 Harvard presidents, one of whom is with us this evening, Derek Bach. Last year's lectures were given by James Q. Wilson on the essentials of free government and the duties of the citizen. I'd like to remind people that the Godkin Lectures are a series, and tonight will be the first in 2 parts, and the lecture tonight will address the role of governments and intergovernment organizations in preventing deadly conflicts. And tomorrow night, the second lecture on the role of institutions of civil society will be given in Starr Auditorium at 7 p.m. There's been a debate in this community recently over who should speak at Harvard. My own view on this is anyone who's relevant to public policy should speak at Harvard, and that when somebody speaks at Harvard, it is not necessarily an endorsement, but it's in our interest to have as wide a range of views represented as possible. And I've pointed out to students when they've asked me about this, what my view is, that there is an exception, which is when we have a named lectureship, we are indeed endorsing a person, and that's the case tonight. We have a speaker tonight who we are proud of, and which we are proud to endorse. Dr. David Hamburg is a former professor at the Kennedy School. He was professor of health policy from 1980 to 1982 and director of the Division of Health Policy Research and Education. Since then, he has been president of the Carnegie Corporation from 1983 to 1997, and he co-chairs the Carnegie Corporation's Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict. During David Hamburg's stewardship of the Carnegie Corporation, the foundation appropriated $662 million for grants and special programs to improve education, healthy development of youth, to prevent deadly conflicts among the superpowers, to strengthen human resources in developing countries, especially Africa, and to promote democratic processes in America and abroad. In addition to his leadership at Carnegie, David Hamburg has served from 1975 to 80 as president of the Institute of Medicine at the National Academy of Sciences, and from 1984 to 86 as president and then chairman of the board of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He has had a distinguished career as a scholar. Before that, he was professor and chairman of Stanford University's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And in recent years, his work has focused on child and adolescent development. He's the author of Today's Children, Creating a Future for the Generation in Crisis, and co-author of Great Transitions, Preparing Adolescents for a New Century. In September 1996, President Clinton awarded David Hamburg the Presidential Medal of Freedom, this nation's highest civilian award. Please join me in welcoming David Hamburg back to the Kennedy School.
Thank you very much indeed. This is clearly a family reunion kind of occasion. I'll move these mics up. I just am getting over a nasty laryngitis, so if it turns out that my voice slips as I go along, raise your hand in the back. The mic should compensate for my deficiencies. Joe, thank you very much indeed. It's a privilege to count Joe Nye as a friend. I've watched his career with great admiration, his academic achievements, and his government service over several decades. He wrote a book a few years ago called Bound to Lead, which is about the United States of America, but it might be said about Joe Nye as a person, bound to lead. I have deep satisfaction about my years on the faculty here, my years on the visiting committee at the Kennedy School. I think it's a marvelous institution, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to give these lectures. Harvard people have contributed so much in this field really quite fantastic over the years. And I personally am intellectually very much indebted to, as a matter of fact, many of you in this room, on certain subjects. Other subjects I won't mention, but on this particular subject of preventing deadly conflict, I'd have to first of all thank my dear friend Graham Allison, who's been a major contributor to preventing deadly conflict, intellectually, organizationally, and specifically in the Carnegie Commission, about which I'll speak tonight. Other major contributors here to this field. Of course, I must say, I'm sorry Al Carnesale isn't here. Our old Avoiding Nuclear War group, Allison, Nye, and Carnesale, and many others that they involved brilliantly, in my judgment, was the single most important non-governmental project during the Cold War. A project that made an enormous difference, and I'm prepared to defend that proposition if you want to challenge me. Bob Blackwell, Cicely Bach, Abe and Tony Shays, Michael Brown, Ash Carter, Howard Rafa, John Dunlop, Roger Fisher, Herb Kellman, Shai Feldman, and the faculty and fellows currently at the CSIA. I have a list too long to read, but the CSIA is a beehive of activity on this subject at the present time. Also, some of my Carnegie colleagues are here. David Speedy is here. Karen Valentine is here. I'm not sure if Astrid Tumines is here or not, but in any case, those are three people to whom I feel very indebted. I should say that the grant-making activity of Carnegie in the preventing deadly conflict field has a very dynamic interplay with this commission that I'm going to speak about. Now, having ticked off so many major contributors in this field, and undoubtedly having left out some, it is kind of awesome. As given the complexity of this subject and the vast knowledge of this audience, it may be presumptuous of me to set out these propositions, which I'm about to do. Maybe it's my medical background that eggs me on. There is a story that some of you may know about a great man, whoever it was, who went to heaven and was instructed by St. Peter that he would have to abide by the very egalitarian rules that prevailed. When it came time for meals, that there was a chow line, and you would stand in line like everybody else, regardless of your preeminent stature on earth. That was accepted. But this great man noticed that there was a little fella in a white coat with a stethoscope in his pocket who every day rushed up to the head of the line. And it became more and more infuriating. And when he next saw St. Peter, he inquired, "Who is this presumptuous guy with the white coat and the stethoscope?" St. Peter said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot to tell you. That's God. He likes to play doctor." Well, the fact is that my medical background has some bearing on this. I mean, in very short form, in a sentence, I went from working in emergency rooms to intensive care units to public health, as to say, how did these casualties get here in the first place? And if you get immersed, as some of our commissioners have been in Bosnia and Rwanda, it's like all the emergency rooms and all the intensive care units in the world put together in a single horrible situation. And you have to ask, if you have any intellectual curiosity at all, where are these casualties coming from? What could be done at an earlier stage to prevent these casualties? And that is why I convened this commission and challenged these people to think in those terms. Basically, a public health approach to mass violence. The day before Franklin Roosevelt died, April 11, 1945, he was working on the planning for the post-war period, since the end of World War II was then foreseeable. And he wrote the following in his own hand: "The work, my friends, is peace. More than an end to this war, an end to the beginnings of all wars. Yes, an end forever to this impractical, unrealistic settlement of the differences between governments by the mass killing of peoples." Impractical and unrealistic. That, I think, captures the essence of it. The spirit of our commission and our grant making is similar to that view. We have taken a long-term worldwide view of conflicts likely to emerge and seek ways to prevent those conflicts. 10, 20, 30-year time horizon, hard as that is, causes great eye strain, of course, but also near-term steps that could lead to a continuous process of upgrading our knowledge and skill with respect to preventing deadly conflict. Now I want to focus on the Commission. This is my own highly idiosyncratic short version of 3 years of work. The whole set of volumes will represent. The precious collaboration of leadership with Cyrus Vance, a marvelous human being known to many of you, Secretary of State in the Carter administration, and Jane Hall, who actually has a military background and served on the National Security Council, both with President Bush and President Clinton, before I stole her away. This it really has been a unique opportunity over the past 3 years. The effort has been rooted in the spirit of Andrew Carnegie's restless, searching, almost desperate quest for peace early in this century. Carnegie was an authentic pioneer in both industry and philanthropy. And he was searching for conditions and institutions conducive to durable peace. And sometimes I've gone at great length about the really creative ideas that he had, the ideas that he tried to press on President Wilson and many others, and peace palace he built in The Hague and so on. And people will then sometimes ask me, well, wasn't he, after all, a robber baron? And my short answer is, well, he was a very special kind of robber baron. But in any case, he's our robber baron. And we prize the heritage of his search for preventing deadly conflict. So the Commission is producing a series of reports and background papers and books, culminating in a final report that will be disseminated widely throughout the world as a stimulus to preventive policies and actions. We're going to go all over the world, take the show on the road, and explain what we've said and why, and above all, try to stimulate interest in preventing deadly conflict globally, to generate better ideas, of course, partly by creating a network of cooperating universities. And in this effort, I count Harvard as a principal ally, since Harvard has been a principal source of ideas and information for this Commission from the start. Prevention is based on anticipation, even long-range foresight, to the extent possible. In this kind of an effort, the best available knowledge from research is used to clarify the main paths to a certain kind of rotten outcome. Lee Shore is here, and I believe she has coined that term, rotten outcome, which applies wonderfully in Bosnia and Rwanda, Lee. In this case, major risk factors that enhance the likelihood of mass violence. Having done that, steps are taken to counteract or avoid the risk factors, especially through appropriate changes in behavior. To do so, attention is given to pivotal institutions that can shape and support behavior positively away from the risk factors and dangerous directions. If that sounds like public health, so be it. This is public health in the sense of the ultimate epidemics. It's very interesting that the commissioners, the 16 or 17 of us on the Carnegie Commission, have mostly tried to resolve very bitter conflicts, often at a late stage. And so we challenged ourselves in this enterprise to ask what might have been done earlier. These are very hard problems. If it were otherwise, prevention would have gained ascendancy long ago. Our various reports make no sure bets, but this approach can change the odds. You may recall that great American social philosopher Damon Runyon once said, "The race is not always to the swift, the battle is not always to the strong, but that's the way to bet." And we're hoping that the world will come to place some bets on certain approaches to deadly conflict that we're trying to begin to elucidate. Prevention, bear in mind, consists not only of avoiding escalation in a crisis, though it certainly does include that, but also of creating a durable basis for peaceful alternatives. In the long run, we can be most successful in preventing ethnic or religious or international wars by going beyond ways to avert immediate confrontation in order to promote democracy and market economy and the creation of civil institutions that protect human rights. If that is your ultimate long-term aspiration, then you have to address recommendations to many elements of the international community, among them the democracies, the United Nations, regional organizations, the business community, the global scientific community, educational and religious institutions, the media, and non-governmental organizations. But the main thing that we're seeking is a way of thinking that might become pervasive in many institutions and in public understanding. As we examine the relevant institutions, I have to say candidly, we found them all modest in preventive achievements and not strongly oriented toward this great mission. Indeed, several of the institutions I've referred to in passing just now have probably done more harm than good in regard to hatred and violence. And yet the people of the world cannot let that record stand. The stakes are just too high and the dangers of the next century too great. So we've tried to make suggestions that would strengthen each actor, each institution, strengthen for prevention, and to find good examples, even if honestly they're rare and hard to come by, and to identify best practices through which their potential could be fulfilled. One important point for us in the United States, even though Carnegie is a US-based foundation and the report draws heavily on American scholarship, we have come to the conclusion that the prevention of deadly conflict over the long term is too hard, intellectually too hard, technically too hard, politically too hard, to be the responsibility of any single nation, however powerful, or of any single institution, however significant. Strength must be pooled, burden shared, and labor divided among actors. This is a practical necessity. So what we've tried to do is to clarify the tasks and strategy, look at some of the tools available, the opportunities for various actors, who can do what to make a truly civilized world. All right, let's take a couple of minutes to look at a horrible example. It's intended to warm up our circuits. I hope you won't find it too repellent. It's the 1994 slaughter in Rwanda that still reverberates around the world. In 3 months, 800,000 or 900,000 people were killed. It's one of history's worst episodes. They were killed with relatively simple weapons, and the derivative killing goes on right now in Central Africa. For the international community, the chief legacy of Rwanda is the knowledge that mass violence rarely happens without warning. And the absence of external constraints on hostile groups allows people to conduct genocide at will. The Commission convened a group of distinguished military officers, mainly from the US Army, on an international panel to look at this situation. We're very grateful to Bob Blackwell, who suggested it to us. This panel concluded that the slaughter in Rwanda could have largely been prevented had a rapid reaction force existed under international control. The panel recommended that the core of a rapid reaction force be contributed by the member states of the UN Security Council at any given time. And the nucleus would be a well-trained, cohesive infantry brigade with its own weapons, helicopters for in-country transportation, with logistical and communication support. About 5,000 people, not a big force. The mandate would be to use all the necessary means to separate the adversaries and stop their violence. That is, operational prevention in an impending crisis. That's what General Dallaire, the Canadian commander, who was on site at the time, said. If he had 5,000 troops with the right mandate, he could have prevented the slaughter. But in fact, the troops he had were pulled out. Later, the Security Council passed an empty, meaningless resolution to send troops back in, but it was a party they gave and nobody came. That is, the member states would not provide the troops. So there was no rapid deployment force that could have provided that, what was so badly needed to prevent the slaughter. However, the panel we convened was not asked to address and did not address the much harder question: supposing we had had the force, what then? What then? Or in Bosnia, even now, belated as the intervention was, terribly belated, after genocide. But in Bosnia now, where is the civilian equivalent of NATO? Where are the functions that could do what's necessary? Of course, in the short term, relief aid is essential. But in the long term, you've got to work toward equitable development with conflict resolution mechanisms, preferably embedded in democratic institutions. That's a tall order for Rwanda and many other places. The international community is pitifully weak in helping with such matters, yet they're not beyond human capacities. Please bear in mind that the peaceful, almost civilized Europe of today, Bosnia aside, which we enjoy very much, was the site of humanity's worst ever savagery during the first half of this century. Not so long ago, not so far away. So many of you will be thinking, though, but that was very far away and long ago, and anyway, the wench is dead. What could we do? Why should we bother? Who is we, anyway? Well, more on that later, partly today, partly tomorrow. But just a brief word on the general nature of this problem. It's not just Rwanda. This peaceful time since World War II has had 150 wars with millions killed. After the Cold War, we've had a rash of ethnic, religious, and nationalist conflicts within states. They don't even count as war by the old definition. The UN was not set up to deal with conflicts within states, but they have a high potential for spillover in many ways. They're fought with conventional weapons, with strategies of ethnic annihilation or expulsion. They kill civilians more than soldiers at a rate of about 9 to 1. They deliberately target women, children, and the elderly. They use modern conventional weapons. They're enormously destructive, can be bought as easily as food. An AK-47 can be bought for a few dollars. Now, many factors make societies prone to warfare. Let me just tick them off very quickly, some of them. Weak, corrupt, or collapsed states, illegitimate or repressive regimes, severe discrimination against ethnic or other social groups, poorly managed intergroup differences, politically active religious communities that promote hostile messages, political and economic legacies of colonialism or of the Cold War or both, sudden, drastic economic and political shifts, widespread illiteracy, disease, and disability, lack of resources such as water and arable land, large stores of weapons and ammunition, threatening regional relationships. When any of those long-standing cleavages are exploited by political demagogues, the scene is set for violence. And that is usually what happens. Demagogic leadership triggering mass violence. Now, the human species, of course, has a virtuoso capacity for making harsh distinctions between groups and justifying violence on whatever scale the technology of the time permits. Moreover, fanatical behavior has a dangerous way of recurring. All that is very old in the human legacy. But what is historically new and very threatening is the destructive power of our weaponry and its ongoing worldwide spread. Also new is the technology that permits rapid, vivid, widely broadcast justification for violence. And these factors, so far, are only accelerating into the next century. So if you look out 20 or 30 years, we don't see the slightest reason to believe that our children and their children will be able to avoid horrendous problems. And of course, this is a subject that deserves the most penetrating scholarship of just the kind that has been going on at Harvard for a long time, certainly prominent during the Cold War and since to this day. All these considerations are made more complex in a way that we don't pretend to understand by the rapid and drastic world transformation in which we're now living. The power of technological advance and global economic integration to change social conditions drastically is a critical issue of the conflict agenda, and I hope we'll come on to the Visions of Governance project in due course. If you need a reminder, yesterday's financial markets provide that kind of reminder, these stunning developments that involve the way in which financial markets are tied together, but the way in which the world is tied together, and the profound social dislocations associated with that. It's very hard to say what impact that will have on the conflict agenda. Now, in the long run, preventive efforts should address, to the extent possible, the kind of underlying or predisposing factors that I've just sketched. But in the short run, we have to do whatever we can to prevent a simmering crisis from exploding into a binge of killing and destruction a la Rwanda or Bosnia. So let me turn to a brief sketch for such emergency actions, operational prevention in the face of crisis. Now, I need to sketch out operational prevention briefly and structural prevention briefly. I noticed, maybe you noticed too, that Mr. Castro in their, what was it, Communist Party conclave a couple of weeks ago, spoke for 7 hours. Do you mean to tell me that his subject is more important than operational and structural prevention? So sit back, and I have about 6.5 hours to go. What I will only sketch the elements of operational and structural prevention. First, operational. There are 3 key factors. One is, for operational prevention, you need an international organization or a leader around which an international effort can mobilize. Second, you need a coherent plan of action. And third, you need adequate resources for proper implementation. That may seem obvious, but it's not so obvious. Very often, a reasonable plan of action is, let's say, put forward in a UN Security Council resolution or a speech by a president or a prime minister, and then nothing is done. So that the adequate resources and commitment to implementation is absolutely crucial. Early warning and early response. The early warning, a very interesting monograph on that by Alex George and Jane Hall that the Commission has just put out recently. But the bottom line is that the early warning, by and large, is adequate in the modern world. It's the response that fails. There are some typical indicators of the explosion. One, an upsurge in egregious human rights violations, increasingly brutal political oppression, inflammatory use of the media like hate radio in Rwanda and Bosnia, a buildup of arms, and a rash of organized killings, albeit on a small scale. Clear warning. There's nothing terribly subtle about that. But eminent people, in the face of such warnings, typically say, well, we're not sure, we don't know, maybe it's genocide, maybe it's not genocide. If it's genocide, it means you're both supposed to respond to the Genocide Convention. So therefore, you don't want to say it's genocide. But whatever it is, it's not good. And the warning is available. And in terms of response, one of the critical features is to identify those individuals, institutions, and initiatives which, if properly supported and strengthened, could defuse the situation. Moderate leaders in government and in other powerful institutions are one of the key factors. Well, if you respond with preventive diplomacy. And that builds on traditional diplomacy, but it's more intensive, it's more urgent. It brings in additional elements. There are, by the way, now, the way the world is pushed together with interaction across national boundaries in so many levels, there are lots of bridging people, not only governmental diplomats, but people in the business community, the scientific community, and so forth, who can help to clarify opportunities to correct stereotypes and to build a network of moderates. But I have more to say on that tomorrow. But governments have to do more than they're now doing to use their ambassadors, senior foreign office officials, and personal envoys of the UN Secretary General. We have a whole monograph on upgrading the efficacy of special envoys for the UN Secretary General. One thing not to do is to break off relations. That's a time when you desperately need accurate information. And the old diplomatic gambit of breaking off relations is one of the worst things you can do. Preventive diplomacy also needs public understanding. Leaders really have to explain what are the stakes, why do we have to pay attention to this problem. It is often useful to put the crisis on the agenda of the UN Security Council or on the relevant international organization, regional, like the Organization of American States or the Organization of African Unity. Put it on early enough to permit preventive action with legitimacy. To have it on a UN or regional organization agenda doesn't by itself mean very much, except that there's some kind of broad international consensus that this is important and something needs to be done. more and more the pattern has evolved of subcontracting. The Security Council subcontracts to the United States to do something, or to some coalition, some ad hoc coalition to do something. But there is a factor of legitimacy involved. There's been quite a good bit of scholarship about the factors that go into successful preventive diplomacy, but I won't take the time to go through that. They're very familiar to you here. A lot of the work on that, in fact, was done at Harvard. But the range of topics is very broad that can go into the preventive diplomacy. Peaceful border adjustments, new constitutional arrangements, power sharing, forms of regional or cultural autonomy, even in exceptional circumstances, processes that can lead to an amicable divorce or partition. Now, a lot of non-governmental organizations are very good at this, and some of them have been spawned by Harvard, like the Conflict Management Group. I want to say more about those tomorrow, because I think it's a wave of the future, where governments are reluctant to act. Sometimes a first step can be taken, as happened in the Israeli-Palestinian situation through the Oslo Connection, by a non-governmental organization, which then relates to one or more governments. Now, the preventive diplomacy needs to be able to draw on economic measures, and they may include sanctions, inducements, economic conditionality, and the dispute resolution mechanisms of international trade organizations. There is actually a flourishing set of activities in the economic field whereby disputes are settled not only short of violence, but at an earlier stage than used to be the case. There are very interesting opportunities for economic inducements, or more often a package, a sort of carrot and stick package of inducements and sanctions. It takes a lot of doing. It takes a lot of international cooperation. Unilateral sanctions, even by a country as powerful as the United States, tend not to be very effective. Sanctions, one of the most interesting, perhaps the most interesting development in the sanctions field at the moment is the possibility of targeted financial sanctions. As high-tech advances that permit you to track the money of the elites who are doing the damage, and to make it particularly difficult for them to use the money to buy weapons or for their own personal enrichment. So that is something that needs very much to be pursued, to limit the ability to keep the arms flowing and even to jeopardize the hold on power of some very bad guys. The inducement case was prominent in North Korea, as you know, where some very attractive inducements were given to the North Koreans in conjunction with the threat of sanctions and indeed even the threat of war. There are many different inducements that in a variety of situations: direct purchases, subsidies, economic aid, favorable taxation, access to needed technology, military to military contact, possibility of membership in good standing of valued organizations. Some combination of political, military, and economic elements are typically put into an overall package of inducements. Conditionality simply means the forging of links between responsible nonviolent behavior on the one hand and integration into the community of market democracies on the other, or the opening up of distinctive opportunities on the other. It may surprise you, but I guess I've already foreshadowed that forceful measures have a role too in preventive diplomacy, in operational prevention. In our view, the use of force is not a last resort. It needs to be considered at an early stage in exactly the sense that I mentioned to you vis-a-vis Rwanda, a rapid deployment force to separate the hostile forces, to get some political space, to get some breathing room in which preventive diplomacy can work. Such a force would have to be international, would have to have the legitimacy in most cases of a blessing from the UN Security Council, but could be terribly helpful in some desperate situations to stop the violence at a small scale and then take other political, military, social, psychological measures and go beyond the immediate stopping the killing. So much for the briefest sketch of operational prevention. Now, structural prevention seeks to address the root causes of conflict to the extent that we understand them and can do something. It involves a long-term and multifaceted approach to create an environment in which human rights and economic opportunity and physical security are protected. A key component is the creation of visible mechanisms for the peaceful resolution of disputes. Much of the world simply doesn't have such a mechanism. The education in much of the world about the concepts and techniques and processes and institutions of conflict resolution is one of the most important educational jobs that any of us could possibly do. Now, the Commission picks out some very hard long-term tasks for governments and international organizations in the way of structural prevention. These are powerful desiderata that deserve much more serious and sustained attention than they now receive. And the Commission makes suggestions about promising steps toward fulfilling these desiderata. What are they? Very briefly stated. Control, reduce, and yes, eventually eliminate weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, as well as nuclear. Control the trade in conventional weapons. Control terrorism. There is a very important project here now starting on grand terrorism. Advance the rule of law as the basis for regulating social interaction. Promote representative and accountable government. For example, an important new emphasis of the World Bank. Promote equitable economic development in ways that can be indigenously absorbed and sustained. Now, obviously, these are big tasks that people have worried about for a long time. We try to pick out in our reports what we think are some of the best experiences and best ideas about the roles of the UN, of regional organizations, and states in tackling these very hard problems. There is no time now to spell these out, but let me mention one that is very salient, very practical, and surprisingly controversial, and which is being worked on here. And that is, what is the role of the community of established democracies in preventing deadly conflict? In fact, both in operational and structural prevention. What is that role, anyway? We conclude, and I personally would state it much more strongly than the Commission does, that by pooling their considerable political and economic and technological and intellectual and even moral strengths, the established democracies can make a major contribution to structural prevention, drawing upon well-developed legal standards, accepted procedures, and international norms of fairness. Depending on the degree of interest in dealing with a specific problem, these states can act in varying combinations, whether through the UN system, through regional organizations, or other mechanisms. Now, these matters are brilliantly illuminated in a draft paper prepared by Graham Allison and Hisashi Owada, Japan's distinguished ambassador to the UN, prepared at our urgent request, and oddly enough, not without some courage. It turns out that in most of the world, there's a very great ambivalence toward the established democracies, and above all, the United States. 1997. A great deal of respect and a great deal of apprehension. I would characterize it, I think, most by envious resentment. Strong, envious resentment of what we have and what we are. To us, what we see as responsible behavior is often seen as arrogant behavior by much of the rest of the world. Developing countries, emerging democracies, as well as dictatorships. Graham and I are in agreement. The problem is not too much assertion of responsibility by the democracies in the post-Cold War period, but rather, to a large extent, a minimizing of responsibility. It's an abstinence problem, a withholding of commitment by the democracies, in our view. And our colleagues throughout the world believe that. They beat up on us in the Commission and elsewhere. Why aren't you meeting your responsibilities? But I kid you not, there's hardly any suggestion we've been able to make that isn't immediately responded to in a kind of horror. US, Europe, Japan, hegemony, neo-imperialism. You thought that passed in the 60s. There are new forms of it in the late 90s. A few of my friends here know that for some years I lived across the street at Stanford from a Frank Lloyd Wright house, and I got absorbed in the lure of Frank Lloyd Wright, a fascinating character. I must tell you in this context of our perceived arrogance about one of our most arrogant great men. Frank Lloyd Wright was once called to testify in court. The attorney asked him, state your name. He said, Frank Lloyd Wright. State your occupation. He said, world's greatest architect. The attorney said, you're not very modest, are you, Mr. Wright? And Wright said, sir, I'm under oath. Well, I'm afraid that's the kind of problem that we face, but it cannot be avoided. And that's why the Allison Owada paper is so important for the purposes of our commission, to develop in detail and with sensitivity. We must approach this with sensitivity to the concerns about our arrogance or even our dangerous attributes. But it has to be tackled. What is the role of the established democracies in operational and structural prevention? One final word about a newly emerging aspect of both operational and structural prevention, really. Preventive defense. It's become a major principle for international conduct in the past few years, best exemplified by the leadership of William Perry, the Secretary of Defense, and his collaboration with Ash Carter in the Defense Department. And Bill Perry and Ash Carter are continuing their collaboration, I'm happy to say, with Carnegie's support, to develop these ideas further. The strategy rests on 4 pillars: alliances, regional confidence building, constructive engagement, and nuclear nonproliferation. It's modeled on the policies that were so successful after World War II, the thinking that went into the formation of the UN, that went into the creation of the Marshall Plan, and the creation of NATO. That kind of thinking, but with Cold War removed from it, can turn erstwhile adversaries into partners for economic development and interstate peace. Operationally, preventive defense makes use of exchanges, technical collaboration, of joint military exercises, and other military-to-military contact across many national boundaries, for example, to help establish civilian control of the military in emerging democracies. The general thrust of these basic efforts really has to do with confidence building in the most fundamental sense, openness, mutual understanding, patiently building a basis for trust. One other intergovernmental institution I mentioned only in passing, I touched on the World Bank in a sentence. The international financial institutions have immense potential for structural prevention, and the World Bank is beginning to move in that direction. Fundamentally, it is, in the terms of social psychology, a superordinate goal, that is, to provide major economic resources if and only if adversaries work together. Then they can get what they want. It can be groups within a country. It's more likely to be across national boundaries. But the leverage, the powerful leverage of the international financial institutions for eliciting regional economic cooperation akin to what we did with the Marshall Plan after World War II. That has great potential, and our commission has generated 2 papers coming at that problem from different angles. So I've given you a very brief sketch of our rationale and approach, some of the tools available to the international community, a very long way to go. A brief concluding comment. My dear former colleague, the late Fred Heckinger, when he worked with us over a number of years, visited one of the advanced schools in New York elementary schools. And a student in the elementary school was asked, who was Socrates? And the reply was, well, I'm not sure exactly. He was an old man who talked too long and they poisoned him. Wishing to avoid that fate, I will close well short of Castro's designated time limit for me. I just want to emphasize so strongly what a leadership role there is for Harvard in this kind of effort. It's been there, it's been utilized, it can be utilized even more fully in the years ahead. People of humane and democratic inclination will need intellectual leadership and sustained cooperation throughout the world to tackle this great, difficult mission of preventing deadly conflict. There are useful models. There are very interesting ideas. There's a lot of good analytical work going on. And the current turmoil could, in fact, provide a constructive stimulus for practical arrangements that would help us at last to learn to live together. As our children and their children learn about the horrifying mass violence of this putatively civilized 20th century, we hope to be able to say that at the beginning of the third millennium, the communities of the world at least planted a few seeds of cooperation and reconciliation that could someday grow into a system in which mass violence would become diminishingly rare. In the most fundamental sense, the Carnegie Commission is about decent human relations and human groups learning to live together. In these matters, the earth is still essentially flat, but it cannot remain flat forever. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We have two microphones here and a chance to ask questions. While members of the audience have a chance to collect their thoughts on questions, let me pose an initial one. I was quite struck by your introduction citing the case of Rwanda. When I was in the Pentagon, I was sent out to Rwanda, and we concurred in the analysis that you came up with, which is, in fact, it took quite some time to kill that many people. So even after the killing began, there were weeks, indeed months, when intervention could have stopped the killing. And we saw a possibility that something like that was going to happen next door in Burundi. But when we tried to propose to neighboring African states that they would put up forces for a rapid intervention force, there is no willingness to become involved. And even back home, if you asked if the American public would be willing to do it, there was likewise no willingness to be involved. The best we could do was that the Pentagon was willing to say, after some bureaucratic toing and froing, that we would put up transportation and logistical support if the African countries would put up the troops. And that, again, didn't succeed. So the question is, given that circumstance, had you been in that policy-making position, what would you have done?
Well, let me make a little detour on that. I just spotted Richard Wrangham in the audience, whose research on the evolution of human aggression has been exceedingly important. And Richard may remember an episode. I don't remember, Richard, whether you were at Gambia in about 1970 when we suddenly had that influx of refugees from Burundi. My point is, we had a little research unit on non-human primates in Tanzania, very near Burundi. We had, at any given time, 25 or 30 people there. And suddenly, almost overnight, we had 60,000 or so refugees in the neighborhood from the Hutu-Tutsi violence at that time was Burundi, but basically the same problem, Burundi, Rwanda. I tell that personal story partly because it has meaning for Richard and me, but also because these cycles have been going on for decades. And so, as a matter of fact, I was a biomedical behavioral researcher in those days. I didn't have any contacts. I went to visit the State Department when I came back to try to explain the nature of this horrendous problem. And they were sympathetic, but basically it was just too far away, too remote from American vital interest to pay much attention. I used to say sometimes that one of the people we were interested in was Diane Fossey, who studied gorillas, that her gorillas got more international attention than the people of Rwanda in that period. But no, it was a terribly hard problem for policymakers. As a matter of fact, in writing the preface to the report, I put in a paragraph that sort of exempts current policymakers. I basically say the world is so poorly prepared to deal with these issues that it's almost beyond imagination what could have been done. You would have needed, I think, over a period of time to build understanding in this country and in Europe, not just in Africa, about the problem, the Hutu-Tutsi problem, the likelihood of further violent outbreaks. Now, that wouldn't have to have been just all along in an even-paced way. So about 2 years before the genocide, Africa, one of the human rights organizations for Africa, put out a list, an assassination list. It was a long list, and indeed they went very early on. It was a hit list that became available. And they put that out. It was well known that basically the incendiary leaders in Rwanda were looking for an excuse, looking for an opportunity. When the two presidents got killed in the air crash, no time was wasted. I think what we're doing in this is to look ahead and say, our policymakers have been in an impossible position. What can we do as an international community, as states, as regional organizations, as international organizations, and tomorrow as non-governmental organizations? What can we do to put our policymakers in a position that they have some tools available to act in that kind of circumstance? You didn't have any, really, as far as I can see. And I'm not just saying that as a friend.
Well, the microphones are open. Yes.
My name is Alexander Rossolimo. I'm with the Center for Security and Social Progress, which is a think tank. Dr. Hamburg, you said that prevention is based on anticipation. Earlier this month, FBI Director Free testified before Congress about the new security threats to the United States and the world. Quote, he said, acts of terrorism, the theft of nuclear materials in Europe, organized crime, computer crime, and drug trafficking, which are no longer constrained by boundaries or inhibited by global distance. So my question is, how does one anticipate, deter, and prevent such threats to peace and security?
Well, this is why I mentioned this new project on grand terrorism, and Graham Mallis and his colleagues work on the so-called loose nukes problem and so on. It's a very alarming subject in which there's been far too little serious scholarship. I think we have to understand the problem much better. It obviously will involve a level of cooperation that we're not accustomed to, for example, of sharing of intelligence. But those are global problems. The State Department made an important innovation in the Clinton administration to create an Undersecretary for Global Affairs, somebody with an explicit mandate to look across that range of inherently global problems. There are some places like St. Andrews in Scotland that have serious centers of scholarship on terrorism. Again, to come back to a personal story, this same research unit in East Africa that I mentioned was the object of a terrorist exercise in 1975, engineered by Mr. Kabila, who is today the king of the Congo. 4 of our colleagues were taken hostage and held for several months in an African political problem. When I tried in 1975 and the few years thereafter to stimulate academic interest, let alone governmental interest in problems of terrorism, the general response was that that's Africa. That doesn't happen. The United States is essentially immune from such matters. We have been very slow to grasp the significance of this problem. It needs to be studied very carefully, and I think it's going to be an extremely hard problem to deal with. I remember once, Joe, it's a vivid memory for me in the Avoiding Nuclear War project, I brought up early the question of biological warfare. And Joseph, are you serious? Have we got enough problems with nuclear? So I said, okay, we've got enough problems with nuclear. But it was, for somebody in a biomedical background, it was quite foreseeable that biological terrorism would be an emerging problem, and a very difficult one, I have to say, because the techniques are so simple, it's so inexpensive. The Japanese terrorists who used poison gas were working on biological. So this has got to become a serious subject for the academic agenda as well as the policy agenda.
Dr. Hamburg, as I listen to you tonight and in your previous visits to Harvard, I'm struck by the depth of your caring for the human species. And it seems to me you may be unusual in this regard. It's possible that you're 4 or 5 standard deviations out from the norm. And that makes me start to be concerned that the intentions that you have and the desire to improve the quality of the human life in many different aspects is actually unique or at least unusual. And that the average person who makes up the democratic population doesn't care as much as you do. Their cares are more local. And this makes me think that makes me sort of pessimistic for the chances of the very visionary agenda that you have. And I wonder if you've addressed that question.
Well, I thank you for the very generous spirit of the, of the remark. Much as I'd love to agree with you about your personal assessment, I really can't. The thing I think is that later in this series, if my voice holds out, I'm going to get to leadership. The Commission kept bumping up against the leadership problem over and over again. And, you know, you can't really invent leaders, but it certainly helps leaders to know that there's a constituency. The leader has to be sure he can dash around and get out ahead of his followers. And it's been very interesting to come back to the public health analogy that we have seen a constituency for prevention develop in this country and in a number of democracies. With Julie Richmond here in the audience, I have trepidation to sketch it, but let me try. A key turning point was about 3 decades ago, with the Surgeon General's report on smoking. And in the ensuing several decades, there was not a great deal of leadership from the medical community, interestingly enough, but a public constituency for disease prevention and health promotion began to build, largely as I see it, from some very seminal documents like that early Surgeon General's report, Julie Richmond's later Surgeon General report or set of reports, Healthy People, that caught the attention increasingly of the media. So in my view, it went scientific community to policymaker translation, professional policymaker translation like Surgeon Generals, to the media, to building public concern. And then the public put heat on the backside of doctors, quite frankly, began to say to doctors, why don't you talk to me about smoking? I understand it's important. I'm not just talking about smoking, though. I'm talking about major changes that have occurred in this country in our patterns of smoking and the intake of fat in the diet and patterns of exercise, fiber in the diet, things of that sort. A fairly broad-based set of behavior changes, most of which involve giving up or modifying pleasurable habits, which we're always reluctant to do. Why did we do that? We did that because of a survival motivation. That's how it got translated. If you want to live longer and live better, if you want to survive in some kind of decent life, you better pay attention to changing your behavior for health. And that's essentially what we're saying. And maybe it's more abstract, although it's not more abstract, obviously, if you visit Rwanda or Bosnia, Somalia, or what have you. But it's the motivation for survival that we hope to tap on a broad enough scale. And it will be important to build a constituency for prevention so that leaders will pay attention. And if leaders are interested intellectually, they can feel they won't be at too much political risk by getting into it. We've, as you can imagine, with distinguished members of the Commission from all over the world, we have been making informal contact with prime ministers and presidents and foreign ministers and defense ministers and so on. There is a lot of thoughtful interest, a lot of thoughtful interest. The Bill Perry case I gave is, of course, the ultimate example, but there are very good examples, and I don't want to quote leaders publicly, but I think my sense is that a lot of first-rate leadership in current democracies in Europe and here in Japan really want to do something about just what I've been talking about tonight, and they're looking for ways to do it without too much political risk. Maybe we can help them build a constituency for prevention.
Yes, sir. My name is Leah Johnson. I'm the Navy Fellow at the Security Studies Program at MIT this year. Regarding your comment about if we had had a fast reaction crisis response force in Rwanda, we could have saved a number of lives, or that's your presumption, but I may be wrong, but the way I understand the current UN regulations and charters, they're not allowed to have any standing forces of any type. That's why they have to build the force each time there's a crisis. I may be wrong about that, but I believe that's the case. But even if there were a standing force to interact in this kind of situation, you also have to have the acquiescence of the sovereign nation. Like in Algeria right now, we're having so many needless deaths in Algeria, but the government doesn't want any intervention by the UN. So how can we help in those types of situations?
Well, those are very pertinent questions. On the first one, the UN could do it. The fundamental problem is with the member states who don't want to do it. They don't want to give up any even modest element of control over such a force. And there are ways probably to get around that. You could have a force, a coalition of the willing force that was trained and exercised and ready to go, but would require authorization of the UN Security Council. In any case, you'd have to have a clear chain of command in order to do it. But without, most likely in most cases, without UN Security Council authorization, it would lack the legitimacy. I mean, remember, if we offered to do it alone, or the French or whoever, there would be a serious perceptual risk that we're doing it to choose up sides and all that. So you need the legitimacy. But I think that problem could be dealt with. Sorry, the second part, just give me the headline.
Algeria.
Algeria, yeah, the consent of the beneficiary. Yes, that's a very hard problem. The protection of sovereignty goes very deep. There is an emerging international norm that says we can't live with that forever, that tyrants really mustn't have the right to severely oppress their own people in the name of sovereignty. In fact, Boutros Ghali had the courage to say sovereignty was never what it was cracked up to be, and in any case, it's eroding. That cost him, but I think it's a true statement. However, there is a real problem, and the bigger the country, the better armed it is, the more serious that problem is. However, there are ways to try to connect with the recalcitrant sovereign rulers to help them see it's in their interest to permit some kind of intervention. That may be neighbors who can help in that process. It may be other countries with whom they've had a special relationship in the past. It may be through some key non-governmental organizations. The business community in principle could play an important role. Economic incentives could come into it. But at the present time, it does involve trying to persuade those who are at each other's throat that this won't work very well. One thing that I would personally like to see, which we've had very little of, would be independent, internationally controlled media, and we may be coming to that, which say to the parties who are killing each other and aspiring to kill each other on a much bigger scale, the path you're on is catastrophic for you, not so much for us, but for you. Make it very clear. Look, the peoples of Europe went off gaily to World War I, very happy. The worst slaughter in the history of mankind was about to occur, and everybody was wishfully thinking it would be over soon and our side would win. So that kind of wishful thinking has got to be dealt with. But on top of that, independent media to show the people who are at the real greatest risk that there are better options. And furthermore, that the international community stands ready to help in applying those options. I would like to see that tried. but it's a hard problem.
Tony Shays, Conflict Management Group, Kennedy School, and longstanding friend of David's. As you build up your constituency through the work of the commission, have you gained any insights into why many of these good ideas, some of them have been around for a long time. I mean, Urquhart's paper was back in, 92, 93 on a rapid deployment force, standing force. Why have these ideas not gained a foothold when they are really quite sensible?
But may I say one of the very best collections of good ideas is in a volume edited by Tony and Abe Shays, 96, on preventing deadly conflict in the post-communist countries in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. It's a terrific book. No extra charge for that plug, Tony. It's very interesting when you talk to political leaders, and I mostly talk to them here, but some other countries. The belief is of almost mythic proportions in the political vulnerability of taking preventive action. If you do it and it works, how can you prove that you really prevented the disaster? That's one thing. What will it cost to do it? You know, the cost of not doing it is typically not factored in. But what will it cost to do it? What would the chairman of some powerful parliamentary committee say about it? You know, why should we get involved? Actually, I've had some very disturbing conversations with very thoughtful, generally humane people saying, yes, you're right, these things ought to be done, but not by us. It's just, it's too far away, it's too risky, it's too expensive. If it gets to Cuba or Mexico, maybe. But I think that too far away syndrome is all over the world. Another factor that comes up in a preventive action, typically it, as you well know, involves international and intergroup cooperation. Now, once you start to do that, there is a real risk of choosing up sides. That's been a major vulnerability of the regional organizations. The regional organizations have the great advantage in principle. They're close to the action. Let's say the OSCE in Bosnia, or the EU in Bosnia, whatever. They're close to the action. They know the history and culture much better than we do. They ought to be able to act. Furthermore, spillover is more likely to affect them directly. It's terrific. What's wrong with that is, partly, they start choosing up sides. They're old ties. One country with the Serbs and another country with the Croats, and the next thing you know, you've got sand in the gears of the international organization. So those are some of the factors that come to mind, Tony.
Dr. Hamburg, I guess I'll be playing the role of the pushy Harvard student for the evening. I have a question. Based on an experience I had when I worked at the United Nations Secretariat in 1995, around the time of the UNPROFOR operation in Bosnia, there was a certain amount of optimistic sentiment that the Military Staff Committee of the UN could be possibly endowed and revived in order to provide some strategic leadership for UN-centered military activity. And after I conducted a series of interviews with ranking military attachés from several of the member states, I encountered a great deal of pessimism that states could work together, that the issue of dues payments and personnel deployments could be coordinated in such a fashion to make that work. And I'm wondering, is the Military Staff Committee a viable organ to be?
Well, let me put it more generally. I mean, it certainly has been historically radically neglected. The UN needs some kind of technical military competence, at least at advisory level. It actually gets, I think Joe would confirm, more of that from the United States than we like to admit. Informally, some of our top military leaders have been very sympathetic to the UN, very helpful to the UN at an advisory level. But there isn't, as far as I know, a well-structured mechanism for building any kind of high-level technical competence to understand military issues in the UN. It isn't to say it couldn't happen, but it really hasn't been there, and the member states don't want to do it. Now, of course, a big code in the kind of thing you heard is animosity toward the U.S., even from our allies. Now I'm not talking about some faraway people, even the Brits. I mean, they were, in the past few years, they've all been furious with us. I mean, I had to work some delicate negotiations involving the U.S. and the UN in the past couple of years, and I'm painfully aware of the animosity of our friends and allies, let alone strangers, toward our behavior at the UN. We use the UN all the time. I said to Boutros Ghali more than once, you should not take the criticism personally. You should understand you have an honored and dignified position. You are the world's certified scapegoat. And that is one of the jobs the Secretary General has. And God knows the United States did a lot of that. So when you hear that kind of thing about the UN and military, the syllogism is something like, the U.S. is the only really great military power in the world. The U.S. doesn't pay its dues. The U.S. uses UN as a scapegoat. So how are you going to have any military competence at the UN? The trouble with the UN, by the way, is that there are all those foreigners up there.
Thank you. Thomas Latour, an LLM student at the law school, originally from Croatia, and that will somehow define an egoistically regional question. You said that in Bosnia and Herzegovina we are somehow lacking a civil correspondent to NATO. I certainly do agree with that, and could you elaborate a little bit on what you had in mind? And the second part of the question would be, how do you see a viable security structure in Bosnia and Croatia in the next 5 to 10 years that would not generate further conflict? Thank you.
On the second one, I'm sorry to do a cop-out, but we made a sort of policy decision that we were not going to try to do, in-depth, to use the medical analogy, tertiary care studies. We were going to devote our attention to the primary care, that's the prevention, primary prevention. And so we haven't studied it, and my opinion would not be a good opinion on the second one. But the first one, I really appreciate so much you're asking, because as Graham knows, it's an argument I lost in the commission. When the first time the commission met, I said, what if the international community had something like a corps for peace and democracy, an army for peace and democracy, whatever you want, call it whatever name, a set of readily available competences that could come and help a country in great danger to build competent government, to work toward democratic institutions. It's the kind of thing that I cherish, obviously on a small scale, in the Strengthening Democratic Institutions project of the Kennedy School. I've seen what can be done. Basically, the Commission's consensus was, don't talk about creating new institutions. It's too hard. Nobody wants to create new institutions. I believe that if you really are going to take a 20, 30-year time horizon, you should talk about creating new institutions if you find the existing ones are wholly inadequate to the task. Now, what happened when we finally belatedly got around to the Dayton negotiations and so on? NATO did its job very effectively. Whether you agree with it or don't agree with it, it did the job it was asked to do. There was nothing remotely comparable. Poor Mr. Bildt from Sweden was asked to come in and cobble together elements. Now, some things have been done. I don't want to be demeaning about that. It's such, when you start close to ground zero, it's very hard to do. The best approximation we have right now is various non-governmental organizations, plus the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, a whole bunch of organizations that you can piece together, and they can do different parts of it. I think we should mobilize the Kennedy School and send it into battle. But see, what I'm talking about is you want to help people build conflict resolution institutions. You want them to learn how to conduct elections. The first election is only the beginning, obviously. You want some continuity with respect to elections. You want the building of an independent judiciary, the building of an independent media. All those fundamental structures that are so hard to do take decades or generations to do, but you've got to start someplace. And why should that be beyond human capacity? We can do all these fantastic things that we do, but it's too hard a problem. It's not too hard a problem if you would replicate the kind of things the Kennedy School has done, for example, in and around Russia, on a much larger scale. But I think it would be possible to have at least a core of people prepared to initiate that kind of process if we set our mind to doing it. My voice is gone. I thank you for your patience.
David, you've been heroic. For a man without a voice, you've done a splendid job. Let me remind folks that the second lecture in the series is tomorrow night at 7 o'clock in Star Auditorium, which is in the building next door. And we'll welcome you back again and hope your voice holds out. And thank you so much for a splendid evening tonight. Yes, exactly. Take a throat lozenge. Alas, I'm going to be in Washington tomorrow, and I won't be able to be here tomorrow night. I don't get back until Thursday. But that was really very good. And thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you for doing it. It's great.